Hi, Dan.
Hey Bob, how are you doing?
Cannot complain. How are you?
You know what? We just had the truly glorious day weather-wise to end July, which is wonderful because the entirety of July up here has been either ridiculously muggy or thunderstorm, thunderstorm, thunderstorm.
Yeah, it's been weird here too, but today I have no complaints about the weather. It's been nice.
Exactly.
Let me
Yes.
introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Dan Drezner. It's been a
Mhm.
while since we've talked, but we've been doing it for a long time. You were an old blogging head back when that was the brand this was done under, Blogging Heads.
Every once in a while when I do a Zoom chat, I flash back to when you sent me like a camcorder with a tripod and like this incredible the attachment I will never forget. It was like some sort of card
Yeah.
that had to have been the size of like a credit card that I had to
Yeah.
insert into my computer to be able to so that the computer could download the video and so forth.
And it was powered by a steam engine, as I recall, too, right?
Yeah, basically, yes.
It was pretty old. That's because we were ahead of our time, folks. We started this in 2005 before you had enough broadband. It's a long story.
Yeah.
But we did it. We're still here. And I'm looking forward to this. So I should say a little more about you. You are still a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts of what, technically, international relations?
I'm a professor of international politics, I think is my title.
Politics.
Yes.
Well, there is a difference. There is a difference. We may get to that. A longtime commentator on foreign policy for places like the Washington Post and the esteemed Journal of Foreign Affairs. And long ago, you were early to the blog game. Like, I don't know,
I was
close to 20 years ago, maybe more.
More than 20 years ago, Bob. I think because I remember the first day I blogged was September 10th, 2002. So,
wow.
Yeah, we're now close to 21.
Scary. And now you're doing what's called a newsletter, which is remarkably like a blog, but it's a newsletter on the Substack platform called Drezner's World, right?
It is. It's funny. I can't say that, I never feel right when I say newsletter. I don't know why. It just feels weird to describe it as a newsletter. In fact, even when I write the things, I still call them columns or posts or whatever. But I don't know. That's just my own peccadillos, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, we all get old. And just fail to adapt to the next wave of change and are crushed by it as a result. But I'm sure it'll be fine. Now, I guess the only difference is you're relying very heavily on the email version of this for your audience, whereas blog posts, you could email things out, but that by and large wasn't the way the traffic came.
Correct. Yes.
So I want to talk about, well, for one thing, the Ukraine war, but also to put that in the context of U.S. foreign policy, including the idea of grand strategy, which you've written about several times in recent years. I should say at the outset that you still identify as a realist of sorts. Is that right?
I don't know if I would go. I mean, it's a hard question to answer at this point. Because also, well, no, I'm not kidding. In terms of whether you're talking about realism within the context of international relations theory among scholars, or in terms of whether you're talking about foreign policy recommendations, I guess the way I would put it is that my default assumption is realist. And then the question I always ask is, well, in what ways does that assumption not hold? And to be honest, a lot of times the assumptions don't hold. So I'm willing to, depart from realism. But I'm certainly sympathetic to realism. Let's put it that way.
Well, one thing that's happened is that over the last year, a lot of people who had never really heard of realism in a foreign policy context have heard of it in association with John Mearsheimer, who is only one kind of realist, and in some ways an extreme kind of realist. And maybe we can get into some of that. Now, you were at the University of Chicago. Did you get your PhD at Chicago, where he is, or?
Oh, no, my story is far more sordid, Bob. I got my PhD at Stanford. My advisor, I would add, was Steve Krasner, who later wound up being one of the State Department's directors of policy planning under the second George W. Bush administration. Krasner is also a realist, so you could argue in that sense I was trained by a realist. John was my colleague. I was a junior faculty member at Chicago, and then got denied tenure there, in no small part due to John Mearsheimer. So it's a sordid story.
But we're not bitter. We're not the kind to be bitter, are we?
Well, the way I would let me put it this way. I mean this sincerely. If I could go into the Wayback Machine and change that decision, I wouldn't. I don't think I'd realized until I left Chicago and got to Fletcher the extent to which I was perhaps suffering from battered wife syndrome by being in Chicago. And to be fair, this is like more than 15 years ago. It was a somewhat different time. But let's just say that my public writings were not looked on with enthusiasm by some in the department.
Oh, I see. Was that a big part of the issue, that it was still considered, that blog type of writing was considered beneath the dignity of an esteemed scholar?
Pretty much. I mean, it's a complicated story, and I don't want to bore your listeners too much into it.
I think
it's also ancient history.
I think the more sordid it gets, the better.
Well, let me put it this way. I would argue that in terms of I would say the following. First of all, I think the situation today is radically different from when I got denied tenure. I think now, if you have a public voice, so long as you're also productive in terms of scholarship, that public voice helps you. It doesn't hurt you. In fact, if anything, a lot of academic departments are obsessed with impact and things like that. That was not necessarily true back in the day. My favorite story about this was there was I remember I was going to have my first article published in Foreign Affairs. It was going to be the cover. It was going to be the lead article, which was amazing. I couldn't believe I'd done that. I was waiting for the elevator at the University of Chicago at Pick Hall, and a senior colleague came up to me and said, "So how are things going?" And I said, "I just found out I'm going to have the lead article in Foreign Affairs." And this person sort of cocked his head and looked at me and said, "Why?" And I didn't really have an answer to that. I was not sure. I'm still to this day not entirely sure if it was, why are you wasting your time publishing in Foreign Affairs, or why would Foreign Affairs publish you?
I kind of doubt it was the first of those. What's the second again?
Why would Foreign Affairs publish you? So either way, it wasn't good. And in some ways, in retrospect, that should have been the harbinger for what was to come.
That's one of the warning signs. When colleagues say you're not worthy of being published, that's one of the warning signs, Stan.
Fair enough.
Time to get that CV out.
So anyway, the point is that it legitimately did work out far better for me, and I have no complaints about how things played out.
You were ahead of your time. Everybody in Chicago is now using all known social media to seek publicity.
Oh yeah, Paul Post, for example, is a great professor at the University of Chicago of International Relations. Paul has legitimately innovated in terms of using social media to talk about international relations. He has these great Twitter threads he does every weekend, and highly recommend following him. Admittedly on, I guess it's called X now, whatever the hell the thing is. But the point is, his content is extremely good. Yeah, let's call it Twitter.
We're calling it Twitter.
It's still extremely good. Yes.
Okay. So let's start at the Ukraine end of things. So you did a newsletter piece, I guess in February of this year, around then, called "The War in Ukraine, 1 Year On." And you wrote, "If one looks backwards, the past year has been a solid success for U.S. foreign policy." I'm wondering if you might want to elaborate that on that a little before you tell me whether that's still your judgment. I mean, things at that point, Russia was in the middle of an offensive that didn't seem to be going that great. Now Ukraine is in the middle of an offensive that doesn't seem to be going that great. So first of all, maybe elaborate a little and then let us know if the judgment still stands.
Sure. I mean, I think the way in which I would judge U.S. foreign policy to have been a success during the first year of the war, first of all, the fact that Ukraine simply exists and exists as an independent state. It's worth remembering that, the end of February 2022, most people, and I will add here myself included, did not think Ukraine was going to last long if Russia actually engaged in a full-scale invasion. The fact that Ukraine managed to survive is impressive and mostly speaks to the hardiness of the Ukrainians. But I think something else that you can't deny is the fact that there was a pretty coordinated response, not just from the United States, but from its NATO allies, from its Pacific Rim allies, in terms of both sending arms to Ukraine, imposing sanctions against Russia, diplomatically censuring Russia and sort of ostracizing them in places like the United Nations and so forth. And this is a rare example, really, of also a foreign policy instance in which the intelligence was pretty spot on in terms of what was going to happen. And this gave the Biden administration, I think, close to 6 months to prep for it. And the preparation paid off. And also, they were adroit in terms of releasing intelligence prior to the war in such a way that they weren't able to do in Ukraine what they tried to do, or what they did do in Georgia back in 2008, and also what they did in terms of Crimea back in 2014. The fact that NATO is by and large held together, again, a success. I mean, in some ways, I'm sure history will take that for granted, but the number of headlines I've seen in Politico over the last, 18 months of like, Biden has held the Western coalition together, but how long can that last? I always find, I think I've made fun of that in a subsequent newsletter. But the point is that there's a term that George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, referred to as gardening, meaning that you always sort of, when dealing with your allies, have to be relatively upfront with them in terms of information, and also you're trying to essentially weed. You're trying to make sure that things don't fester, that things don't get out of control. And so, in that respect, I think the Biden administration has done a good job with the coalition that has opposed Russia's invasion. And actually, more recently, I think they're not doing too shabbily with the rest of the world as well. I mean, there's some claims that the global South is more sympathetic. I don't quite buy that. But I do acknowledge that they are, certainly sitting on the fence. But the point is that I think a lot of people were ready to sort of accept, Russia's annexation of various forms of Ukrainian territory as a fait accompli come March 2022. And that's obviously no longer the case. And that's not an insignificant achievement by not just by the Ukrainians, but by the Biden administration and its support for Ukraine.
I actually hadn't planned to bring Mearsheimer into this early, but I think it makes sense. Let's imagine that we lived in what I think he would think is a better world. That is to say, if we had done a deal with Russia and agreed that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, and they didn't invade as a result. Now, I guess there are two versions of this. I mean, John would have liked to have done it maybe so early that they wouldn't even be in Crimea, but let's just kind of leave Crimea aside for now. Suppose it had been right before this war. So there would be no war. Ukraine would have its pre-invasion borders, and I guess in this scenario, well, I don't know what would happen to the territory in the Donbass that Russia already was controlling, but let's imagine whatever you want. The main question is, would it have been a more successful policy if we had avoided this war and left Ukraine in possession of much more territory than they have now as their country, and found a way to give them security guarantees that were the, practical equivalent of NATO membership?
I think I'm going to question your premise there. I mean, that's the problem I have with it, which is I don't think that deal works for a variety of reasons. The first is the last thing you said, that somehow Ukraine would be offered security assurances equivalent to NATO. It's worth remembering they were offered security assurances, and this came through in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine voluntarily ceded. They never had control of the nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapons that the Soviets had installed in Ukraine were on Ukrainian soil. And the understanding was that by giving up those nuclear weapons, Russia was supposed to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I'm not sure any sort of agreement would have been trusted by the Ukrainians because the Russians had violated a previous one. The second thing is that I think part of the reason that Putin invades Ukraine is not so much that I think he was worried about Ukraine joining NATO, but he was more worried about Ukraine being part of the West as opposed to being part of the Slavic sphere of influence, as it were. And so I think for your premise to work, it wouldn't just have to be that Ukraine would stay neutral. It would also have to be Ukraine can't join the European Union. Ukraine can't get access to European markets. It would have to have been that Ukraine would have become a satellite state of Russia. And I don't think the Ukrainians were ready for that.
But there was suppose you were just to indulge my thought experiment. Okay. Suppose it were possible. And I think on the EU front, you might imagine some kind of compromise deal where there was a kind of a rich association with the EU that wasn't as exclusive of Russian-Ukraine ties as, in fact, EU membership tends to be.
You mean like some kind of Eastern partnership?
Yeah, some kind of halfway. I don't know. I mean, we get into that, but the main thing is just indulge the thought experiment. Suppose Ukraine could have security within the border, leaving Crimea aside, within the borders that they see as their own, and there were no war, and all these people weren't dead, and there was no threat of of expansion of the war and so on, what would that be a better world?
I'm not actually sure it would be. There's a way in which, let me put it this way, there'd be a lot less loss of life, one would hope. I mean, the dead weight loss would be eliminated. Presumably the horrible casualties that both Russia and Ukraine have suffered would not exist. You assume or you hope that the disruption to global commerce that was caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way in which they've, basically forestalled Ukraine from exporting grain would be stopped. Those are huge, welfare gains for everyone. That said, in this scenario, Putin essentially would have been using the threat of invasion to have coerced the West to essentially cede Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And it's worth remembering that at the time in December of let's say 2021, it wasn't just Ukraine that was concerned about what Russia was doing. The Baltic states were worried about whether or not they would be defended. Poland is concerned about it. And if Putin pockets a sort of, southern flank where he doesn't have to worry about Ukraine, it would not surprise me if he had then, let's say, tried to put pressure on the Baltic states.
You think he would invade a member of NATO, really?
I don't know if he would have invaded, but I do think that he would have tried to, let's say, apply economic pressure, other forms of pressure as a way perhaps of testing whether NATO actually was going to commit to Article 5.
I don't know. I see. I totally don't see him invading a NATO country, but I also think Ukraine is unique.
Well, wait a minute. Perhaps, but let me put it this way: if you're asking me to accept your premise, right. I'm telling you that in your premise, Putin wins in Ukraine because he's just used the threat of military force to get what he wants, which is a wider security buffer. I can see that, in that scenario, Putin sees himself as having won in Georgia in 2008, won in Ukraine in 2014, won in Syria in 2021, and won in Ukraine again in 2022. I don't think he stops, is my point. I think he then just continues to, expand his ambit.
I would point out there's a sense in which you're afraid that he would get positive reinforcement for bad behavior. There's a sense in which that's almost bound to happen anyway. It seems to be very unlikely he's not going to wind up with some additional territory when this war is over as a result of actually invading this time, not just massing troops at a border. This time that's a kind of positive reinforcement even for invading. Now, you can argue that all things told, it's a strategic loss for him. Yeah. But my point is that I think there's kind of no way around giving him some measure, him winding up with some measure of positive reinforcement for something we don't like. Yeah, right.
I'm certainly willing to acknowledge that. I mean, I think, the question is the ways in which this war ends, it's tough to envisage at this point. But I would argue that what Putin might get out of it in the end, if I was to envision how this is going to end, what you would want would be some sort of version where the status of Crimea actually becomes legally acknowledged by Ukraine. And what's interesting is that Zelensky sort of made moves in that direction in the sort of first half of 2022. As for the Donbass, the real problem is I don't see how Russia backs down from this no matter what, because the problem is that they've legally annexed these 4 territories, right. Two of which they have barely any control over. The other 2, they're sort of losing some control. So I think the problem,
I would say just quickly in Luhansk right now, I think they're actually gaining ground, but you're in Donetsk, you're right.
I think they're losing control, and they certainly in Zaporizhia or Kherson, it's far from clear that they control anything. And I've had enough contacts with Russians over the last 18 months to think that they, at this point, I don't think they know how. I think they're just as flummoxed about how to get out of this as a lot of the commentators observing it. Because the problem is that by committing to the legal annexation, they have thrown their steering wheel out the window. So I don't think there is any negotiation necessarily that ends with this. And I think people are underestimating the degree to which, for that, I think the only way this ends anytime soon, frankly, is if there's continued instability inside Russia that basically forces Putin's hand or his successor's hand.
Yeah, well, where to begin? So first of all, to be clear, are you saying you don't think he'll end the war until he actually controls all of those 4 provinces? I mean, I don't think he's that crazy. I don't think he's actually crazy, although I worry that he could grow more and more desperate and even impulsive, especially if he is threatened with, if he does feel his regime is internally threatened. But are you saying he's not going to give up what he's already gained in these 4 provinces, which I think is plausible? I think if you want peace now, if you want a ceasefire now with Putin, I think you might get one where the lines are. But are you further saying you don't think he will stop fighting until he actually is in possession of all of Kherson and Zaporizhia?
Basically, yes. I mean, he might agree to a temporary ceasefire, but I am skeptical that, and people could argue maybe he'll accept a frozen conflict. I am dubious of this precisely because it creates this embarrassing situation where Russia, by Russian legal standards, Ukraine has invaded Russian territory because they've occupied Kherson and they've occupied parts of Zaporizhia. I don't see how Putin can walk away by saying, well, you know what, we did annex these territories, but now we're going to, give them up. As for whether Putin is crazy, I do want to point out, like, you're concerned that he's going to get crazy if there's more domestic instability.
Desperate, impulsive, so on. Yeah.
Yeah, but my point is that, having a, armed militia on the outskirts of Moscow, I don't know how much more unstable you're going to get. And what's interesting to me is that he hasn't responded in some ways impulsively since then, which I find intriguing.
No, I think he didn't lash out, that's for sure. If anything, people are surprised by the opposite, that he didn't do more lashing out, and that Prigozhin seems to have gotten off as lightly as he's gotten off. But I think if you understood the whole power structure and the role of Wagner in Africa and everything else, maybe it would make more sense. And Prigozhin's degree of practical control of Wagner and the difficulty of prying it away and so on. So anyway, I mean, the reason So you would just say, just keep fighting on? I mean, it almost sounds like if you could get the war to end right now, by your lights, in a certain sense, that would be a good deal because Putin's aims would have been thwarted. My own view is, first of all, I think it's more likely than some people imagine that if you said to Putin, can we stop the fighting right now? He would say yes. Now, a lot of people in the U.S. and Ukraine would consider that unacceptable, maybe, but I think Putin might well say yes. And if that became a frozen conflict, that is in many ways suboptimal, including the fact that he would have gotten a form of positive reinforcement for invading. I buy all that. It's just that I don't see continuing the war having a very high probability of leading to anything better. I mean, it could. It's just that the ways it leads to catastrophe are also non-trivial. And
what is catastrophe in your mind? I want to understand what you mean by catastrophe here, because this is important.
A wider war, NATO getting involved, and it actually bleeding into Western Europe. But true catastrophe, of course, would involve nuclear weapons, which I don't think. Again, who knows if he feels his regime is threatened and he thinks maybe one tactical nuclear weapon would stop Ukraine, and it turns out he miscalculates. I mean, the war is slowly escalating and expanding even as we speak, with more and more cross-border strikes and so on.
Right. Although you mean by cross-border strikes, you're talking between Russia and Ukraine. Because I look at it this way. I'm much more sanguine on these things, I think, than you are. And it basically based on the last 18 months. Because if there are 2 areas where I think actually there are at least tacit understandings between Russia and the West, the first is that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. Under no circumstances should there be, should it spill out anywhere else across those 2 borders. I think the fact that you had, when the missile was shot down in Poland, the fact that was quickly and rather forcefully tamped down suggests that, in fact, neither side wants to see this escalate any further. And Russia, I think, definitely doesn't want to see this escalate any further, because if NATO actually gets involved in terms of troops, it's not going to end well for Russia. The other way in which I think there's a tacit understanding is, and maybe this is me based on everything that Putin has said so far, and the fact that a lot of what he said hasn't come to fruition, is I don't buy the nuclear card on this one. Putin has been constantly, was for the first 6 or 7 months, constantly brandishing the nuclear weapons, particularly tactical nuclear weapons, as we will go there if that's where things go. And And also if the West escalates in terms of arms exports or whatever. The point is, Putin has kept drawing red lines, saying if you cross this, we might use nuclear weapons. NATO has crossed all of those red lines. Nuclear weapons have not been used. I actually think it's not a conceivable outcome, unless, admittedly, you're right. Like if truly Russia's falling apart, but not even, NATO doesn't want that for a variety.
Well, they don't want it, but they can't control it. The extent to which he feels threatened, and I'd say a couple of things. First of all, as for the Poland thing, if you focus on how Zelensky responded to that, which is he said a Russian missile did this, and he basically said NATO needs to join us in the war. Well, it turned out his Ukrainian missile that had, inadvertently, anti-aircraft missile killed these guys in Poland. And he was a little quick to judge. But what that signifies is what you would expect, which is that if I were him, I'd want NATO in the war, because that's the only way they're going to get Russia off their territory. But from our point of view, it includes unacceptable risks. I think we don't want to be in that war. So one thing to keep in mind in terms of risks associated with the continuation of this war is Ukraine wants NATO in it. That's a fact. And they've done a number of things that I think, in a sense, reflect that. And it's an ongoing risk. And then on Putin's side, what I would say is, I don't think he's going to try to use a tactical nuclear weapon anytime soon. But, we agree that we don't know for sure what he'd do if he felt his regime was threatened more deeply than it's been so far. And the threat seems to be coming from the nationalist right. Who did he just arrest? Gherkin, right? Igor Gherkin from the right. That's where I think that's where he feels the threat coming from. And that suggests that to the extent that he feels there's any domestic constituency he has to appease to stay in power, that the process of appeasement would move him toward a more hawkish position in the war. And the last thing I'd say is, I don't think it's likely that he's going to use a nuclear weapon. My view on nuclear war is that if you do something that moves the chances from 1% to 2%, you better have a very good reason. And I don't. So I'd like to know, what is the reason to continue the war? What is the hopeful prospect associated with continuing what seems to be a very bloody stalemate at this point?
Well, again, first, I'm going to question your premise. I'm not sure it's a bloody stalemate. We don't know how the Ukraine counteroffensive is going to play out. I grant you, it obviously has not. You haven't seen breakthrough gains like you saw last fall. I am curious to see whether, it winds up being a little more, somewhat more productive than we have seen today. But I'll grant you that. I think there's a couple of things going on here. The first is just the simple fact that the Ukrainians want to keep fighting. The idea that NATO can just sort of exercise a veto here and say, no, you're going to stop now. That's not going to happen. I think denies the very agency that Putin has been trying to deny for the last 10 years now. And so I don't think that works terribly well. The second reason, to be honest, is I'm not sure you necessarily want Russia to actually have a sort of strategic pause in Ukraine, because if it does that, then it also potentially has the capability to, rebuild relatively quickly, and then potentially go into Ukraine again, with more force and having learned what it's learned over the last couple of years. Let me put it this way: the idea of a ceasefire. I guess my question is, would that be paired with Ukraine actually joining NATO?
It's conceivable that would happen. I think, as a practical matter, I think it would,
because then I think it's a more viable option. In other words, if you're telling Ukraine, look, we know you've been, we know you've lost territory, we know you've suffered grievously, we're going to give you Article 5 from here on in, and that might be a scenario where I could see Ukraine, saying yes to it. I don't think the Russians are going to say yes to that, though, to be clear, because that represents again a strategic debacle for them. But maybe they would find a way to claim that, by making territorial gains, it's fine that Ukraine is in NATO. But again, like I guess I'm pessimistic that there is any deal to be struck. I know that there's a lot of talk out there about, well, why can't we just, end the war? I don't think there's a win set that exists between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO at this point.
Yeah, I don't know, but I know we're not, as far as I can tell, we're not trying to find out. I mean, Zelensky himself has ruled out peace talks. He says so long as there is one soldier on Ukrainian soil, he won't do it. So he has ruled it out.
You mean Russian soldier on
Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Zelensky has ruled it out. Putin has not, and I think lately has explicitly said he's up for it. So I think the days when people can say, well, I'd be happy to talk peace, but Putin won't do it, are just over. And if you're serious about exploring peace, you got to do it, because you got to at least test the waters.
Let me put it this way. So I don't know if were you paying any attention to this kerfuffle about the sort of track 2/track 1.5 talks between some Americans and among others, Lavrov, but Russian officials. Let me put it this way. The idea that Putin is now willing to discuss ceasefire was not clear at all based on the readouts I've seen from those track 2, track 1.5. So if Putin is willing to talk, that is not trickled down to those who have actually been engaging with Americans. I will also say I've had contacts with some of my Russian colleagues over the last year or so, and there is no wiggle room on the Russian side in terms of a way out of this war. So I'm very pessimistic about the premise that Putin is willing to sit down and talk. And so, yeah, I think that's where, and that's where we are. Like, and look at this way: if Putin were to suddenly give an address where he's like, okay, I'm willing to say I will not deal with Kherson and Zaporizhia, just give me Donetsk and Luhansk, and then we can talk. Then, yeah, I do think that merits having some serious conversations and even forcing the Ukrainians to go to the table to talk. But I'm not seeing anything like that coming from Russia. So,
well, you're seeing even less of that coming from the Ukrainian side. I mean, people don't make concessions before they sit down to talk, generally.
No, but they signal they're open to concessions.
Well,
they signal that they're willing to talk, and I don't get that.
Well, I think Putin has said he's willing to talk. He hasn't said he's willing to make. I don't know. You may know more than I do about what the track 1.5. I don't know that much about what came out of that. It sounds like maybe you do, but
yeah, I mean, I read, like, there was the NBC story a couple months ago, about a month or two ago, and then there was the Moscow Times just wrote up something, and basically it suggested that on the Russian side, they are not sure what they want, first of all, and second of all, that they had demonstrated zero wiggle room in terms of territory in Ukraine. So if that's the position, then you can have track 2, track 1.5 negotiations till the cows come home. It's not going to accomplish anything. And I don't know what you're going to have in terms of, you're right that eventually you're going to have talks, ideally, but the problem is that I don't think that even if you tried to sit down now, even if you force Zelensky to sit to the table, you're not going to accomplish anything. It's still going to be decided on the battlefield.
Well, I think the U.S. has the leverage. Let me first say one thing about agency. As you started to shortly before you uttered the word agency, I thought, oh no, Dan's going to use the word agency. This word kind of drives me crazy. But let me say, you said, well, the Ukrainians don't want to end the war, and we have to respect Ukrainian agency. I'm not sure, first of all, how much the average Ukrainian knows about the actual prospects for getting the Russians off Ukrainian soil. Remember, the media has basically been nationalized. They shut down all but one TV station. It's controlled by the government. They banned 11 opposition political parties. They've canceled the presidential election, or postponed the presidential election, postponed the parliamentary election, which I don't think, that's probably not all that extraordinary when there's a war on your soil. But the government's control of the media and their general reluctance to disclose even like casualty figures suggests to me I'm not sure the Ukrainian people aren't more optimistic than is warranted about the chances of ever of getting the Russians off their soil at anything like a realistic cost. So that's just an asterisk I'd add to that. Aside, on peace, I would say, well, try it, make him an offer and see what he says. But I just what are the hopeful scenarios for the war? Just that that the Ukrainian offensive
I would say the most, Yeah, the hopeful scenario for the war is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive actually does sort of split the land corridor. In other words, if they get to Melitopol or such that um, Russia can no longer essentially resupply Crimea without going over the Kerch Bridge. They have that they can't do it via land. That's a serious strategic setback for Russia in terms of the war. Also, presumably, if that happens, it would mean that Ukrainians would regain control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is a legitimate source of concern and is the one thing that really keeps me up at night in terms of how this counteroffensive will play out. Then it becomes an interesting question of to what extent are the Russians willing to actually acknowledge the reality on the ground, as it were. And that's, I honestly don't know. And again, this goes back to this sort of black hole that is what the Kremlin is thinking. But I do think that's a moment where maybe if you're, Biden at that point, you can push the Ukrainians, okay, look, you've accomplished this at great cost. Take advantage of the moment, see what you can get in terms of actually, having some sort of armistice signed. I don't have high hopes for that in terms of an armistice actually being signed, but I do think that's where you would actually, in some ways, my old dean, Steve Bosworth, used to talk about sort of the ripeness of a diplomatic moment. And I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think the diplomatic moment is terribly ripe right now, which doesn't mean that it can't be ripe in the future. And when it does happen, that's when you have to push. And so, again, it's not that I'm opposed to the idea of pushing for diplomacy. I just don't think it's productive now. I think it might be productive after Ukraine achieves a significant, win.
But as a realist, I guess you would acknowledge, well, first of all, do you agree that in purely game theoretical terms, leave aside American domestic politics, all kinds of complications, and just game theoretical terms, the U.S. has the leverage to push Zelensky to the peace talks, right? We're
Absolutely.
supplying the weapons. We can just say, look, you want them to keep coming? You have to settle for this deal. So in principle, we can do that. And by the same token, we have leverage over the Russians because we can say, look, we'll send them 500 F-16. Well, we can't send them that many F-16s, but you know what I mean. You can threaten to not only sustain but accelerate the arms and so on. But certainly, we have the leverage in theory to push Zelensky to the table. Actually, I mean, I think. Well, I was going to pause and say, Donald Trump actually said something semi-sensible.
I was going to say, you realize you sound exactly like Donald Trump,
you got to admit he had the game theory down, right?
I don't think he has the game theory down. I mean, it's like, first of all, yes, let's be blunt. The U.S. can probably force Ukraine to the negotiating table. Absolutely true. The idea that the U.S. will then be able to turn around and go to Russia and say, look, you got to talk now. Otherwise, we're giving them, the farm. We've already given them a lot. I don't think that actually pushes. I don't think that motivates Russia to go to the bargaining table. I find that wildly implausible. As wildly implausible as Trump's other views.
That was actually
policy.
The part that Trump talked about. So far as Zelensky goes, he just said, I'd tell him X. And what he didn't add is the leverage you have is the supply of weapons. So you can see that we have that leverage. I was just going to say, as a realist, I would think you would almost expect a great power to act this way, right? In real politics, this is what great powers do. They're fighting a proxy war, and they tell the proxy what to do, right?
Sure, but if you want me to be, how realpolitik do you want me to be? Because this is where we start talking about things that we're not supposed to be saying out loud. But
I think we're already there, so you might as well.
Okay, then the answer is that one of the great strategic gains from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that weirdly it has made Europe feel far more secure and also pushed Europe in a foreign policy direction that accords well with the United States. There is something to be said, therefore, for, Ukraine wants to keep fighting this war. If Ukraine keeps fighting this war, they are essentially preventing Russia from applying military coercion anywhere else on their periphery. And that, again, is a strategic windfall for the United States. And so if you really want me to be a realist about this, I mean, I like the idea that, the Baltics feel more secure. The fact that Finland and Sweden are now in NATO. The fact that the eastern flank now feels like the longer this war goes on, the more Europe will be prepared to deal with a revanchist Russia when the war ends.
I would add that another thing this war has done is put Russia on a wartime footing. I think its factories are producing more tanks and ammo than they were before. It is being forced to revisit stale military doctrines. So it may well be better prepared for a war 10 years hence than it would have been otherwise. That's just something I thought I'd throw out.
It's possible, although, again, I think that is a fair point, although I don't know how much they're revisiting their stale military doctrine. Like, one of the interesting things is the fact that with all the sort of internal turmoil within Russia, it's the folks who had relative success, like Surovikin, who have been sidelined now. And so I'm not actually sure that they're demonstrating the same kind of learning curve that the Ukrainians have.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, in a way, the upside of the war is it's making nations that previously felt imperiled by Russia feel less imperiled. Mm-hmm. One question I have is, did we have to? I mean, my critique of U.S. foreign policy is that we didn't have to get to a point where they felt imperiled by Russia in the first place. I was against NATO expansion and various other things. And as a way of getting a sense for where you stand on this, I wanted to quote something you said in your newsletter piece, "The War in Ukraine 1 Year On." You were talking about the senses in which this has been a setback for Putin, hasn't gone well. And you say that is a long way to fall for a leader, meaning Putin, who ostensibly spent the last 2 decades trying to make Russia able to compete with the West. That's not the way I would put it. I would say I think Putin spent the first 5 of those years trying to join the West, in effect. And of course, he'd want to be as competitive as possible with anybody, including Western countries. Yeah. But I really believe that he spent the early years of his presidency trying to join the West, in effect. And I could cite the things that I think the mistakes we made that I think made that less likely. But does that make any sense for you? I think I think Mearsheimer might agree with what I'm saying. I'm not sure, but
sure. He definitely would. Yes.
But what do you think?
I think it's a play this way. This falls under the reasonable people can disagree definition. In other words, I think it's a plausible claim you can make that Putin circa 2001 to 2005, 6, right before the Orange Revolution, I would say, in Ukraine, was recognized that the West was vastly more powerful, seemed at least somewhat interested in bandwagoning with the West. I think this was around the time, he proposed that Russia actually even join NATO, which was an idea that NATO never took seriously for a variety of reasons. Let me put it this way: I don't believe that NATO expansion is what causes Putin to take the sort of more hostile turn that he does. It obviously didn't help, and I am perfectly willing to acknowledge that, in particular, the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit,
promising future membership to Ukraine, basically,
and Georgia, was in retrospect a catastrophe, and that was. Never let it be said that lame duck administrations can't alter foreign policy. You can argue that is an area where I'm in complete agreement with Mearsheimer that wound up being a disastrous move. But it's worth remembering that Putin actually, it was the 2007 Munich Security Conference where he first sort of, fires the sort of flare gun of saying, we are no longer going to play by the rules that you assume we're going to play by. And so, there's a valid argument to be made that maybe Putin could have been accommodated. To be honest, if you're asking me what my interpretation of events would be, it would be that I think the lesson that Putin took from both the 90s and the 2000s is that the only way that NATO and the West were going to deal with Russia in a manner of respect was if Russia had sufficient power to be able to push back. That until the Russian military was rebuilt, until the Russian economy was rebuilt, until Russia had significant economic reserves, NATO wasn't going to care a flying fig about what Russia did. And so he benefited both from the U.S. distraction with respect to things like the war on terror and the fact that you had high oil prices that enriched Putin. And my colleague Chris Miller at Fletcher wrote a great book about sort of Putin's economic steps that he took from basically his first 2 decades that allowed him by 2007 to feel like he was in a position where he could, for the first moment, finally push back.
And do you think he was right when he thought that NATO wouldn't care about Russia until Russia got militarily stronger?
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, then I would say
way,
that's a mistake on NATO's part then, because they're incentivizing him to do a military build. And that was a mistake. We did not send the West, and the U.S. in particular, especially under George Bush, did not take the opportunities to integrate Russia into the West. That's my view. And you mentioned the 2007 Munich speech, and you're right. He says, I'm not going to play by your rules, but what he's also saying is, I'm willing to play by the same rules as you. He's very clear in saying the U.S. has been violating international law by invading countries and stuff. He says the UN Charter should govern relations among nations. And by the way, at that point, Russia had complied with the UN Charter in the sense of not invading any countries. The U.S. hadn't. The U.S. had repeatedly violated the UN Charter in Kosovo when he was prime minister, in Iraq, arguably in various other places. And he was very clear about that. And he also alluded to NATO expansion, but those were the two big things. And he was right. He said, look, you say you've got a rules-based order, but you're not complying with the rules you purport to uphold. This can't go on forever. It was as clear a warning as you could ask for. And what did we do the next year? We said, okay, we're welcoming Ukraine into NATO, after Bill Burns sent both a memo to the administration broadly when he was ambassador to Moscow, and an email to Condi Rice that was circulated to the whole national security team saying, this is crazy. This is the worst thing you can do. Ukraine is a red line, unlike any other country on Russia's periphery, right?
All right, a couple of responses to this. First of all, the one thing I want to dispense with is the fiction that Russia, you're right, Russia never invaded never invaded one of its neighbors. However, even during its weakest point in the 1990s, it sure as hell funded and supported a lot of irredentist movements all along the periphery. Think about Transnistria, think about Tajikistan,
we know a thing or two about that, don't we? We know a thing or two about how to do that.
All I'm trying to say is, don't tell me that Russia was clean as the driven snow.
But that's not a violation of the UN Charter. That's not a violation of the law in the way that invading Ukraine was.
Sure. Second, I agree with you that, again, the 2008, the catastrophe of the 2008 NATO summit was that the U.S. really did think, and I will never, the Bush administration deserves all the criticism it gets on this one. They really thought that the declaration was just throwing a symbolic bone to Ukraine and Georgia, not realizing that the Russians would take it seriously. And that's really the catastrophe.
And the Ukrainians, probably.
Right. No, not even the Ukrainians. Because, remember, public opinion in Ukraine in 2008, they were not supporting NATO. They didn't want to join NATO. It was more, there were a few, there were some in Ukraine that wanted to do it. But Ukraine was very divided on this question, even, circa 2014 or 2013. It was only after that. Second, while I certainly accept your point that the U.S. has obviously, violated UN, the UN Charter in terms of what it's done, the one thing the United States hasn't done, which Russia is now doing, is rewriting territorial borders and annexing territory. So if you want to talk about, red lines, I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge the UN, the U.S., yes, in various interventions, has run afoul of the United Nations.
Actually, Dan, I think Russia would say, and I think correctly, that we actually did do that in Kosovo. That intervention was not sanctioned.
Kosovo is not part of the United States.
Well, okay,
Kosovo, we did not, pass an amendment saying Kosovo is the 51st state.
I thought you meant we haven't redrawn any borders unilaterally. The Kosovo intervention was not sanctioned by the UN. And of course, as you know, this drove Russia crazy. I mean, this was
right. It did, absolutely.
We had been saying, don't worry, NATO, it's going to expand, but it's all about peace, harmony, and democracy. The first thing we do is bomb a Slavic country and pry away, from their point of view, a part of the country that is rightfully theirs, from their point of view. But I understand now what you meant. Yes, it's been a long time since the U.S. expanded its own borders by force. Yes.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to say. That say what you will, Russia has now done this. That in some ways is the and I would argue the more egregious, I'm very uncomfortable with the sort of whataboutism. Well, the United States has done all these things. Is Russia really, any different? Yeah, Russia's really different in the sense that it's now legally said, this is the territory. This territory is now Russian territory.
Right.
That's it. And by the way, that's another reason why I think Europe is justifiably concerned about what Russian intentions are going to be going forward. This is why when you have rhetoric inside Russia about, well, technically Poland was part of Tsarist Russia, or the Baltics, or Finland, or so on and so forth. Yeah, I think it's absurd that they're actually going to do anything about it. But on the other hand, what you can now say is they've annexed territory. Like, it's not just as nuclear weapons are supposedly not an unprecedented thing to think about. That's also something you now have to think about in a conceivable way.
No, my critique of U.S. foreign policy is I think it just didn't have to get to this point at all. But that's, that goes back a ways. And I also agree that Ukraine, it was going to be a challenge given the EU and everything to negotiate that. It was a delicate maneuver. I guess I would just say U.S. foreign policy showed nowhere remotely approaching the degree of delicacy required. It was just so ham-handed.
Fair. But also European diplomacy didn't either. I mean, it's always worth remembering that what triggers the Maidan protests in 2013 has nothing to do with NATO, and it doesn't even have to do with European Union membership. It was just about Ukraine getting this Eastern Partnership with the European Union. And that, for Putin, could not stand. And that's what, triggers, Yevtushenko winds up saying no. That leads to, Yanukovych says no. That leads to protests in Kiev. That leads to, the Maidan.
Right. Although the two things I'd say are, of course, the U.S., was certainly supporting the protest movement that led to what I think it's fair to call the violent deposing of the president. Not to say they were supporting the violent deposing necessarily, but they were supporting the movement, that the same one that the Western Europeans were. My point is that Western Europe wasn't alone in this. We were there. Victoria Nuland was on the Maidan and so on. But the connection, there's a kind of connection to NATO, which is that what I think one thing that freaked Putin out about that turn of events was that, and he said something about this at the time, I think he had said back in 2008, he had said, imagine Sevastopol in NATO's hands. Of course, that's where the big naval base is.
It's where the Black Sea Fleet is based.
That scared the hell out of him. And I think it helps explain why he responded to Maidan by seizing Crimea, which I don't defend, but I'm just saying there's a kind of subtle interaction between the EU and the NATO concerns.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing, by the way, that I think scares the hell out of Putin is the fact that it was this color revolution thing that happens. Because remember, the other sort of, fatal step for Putin was when he decides he's going to run for president again in 2011, and there are protests in Moscow, which catch him by surprise. This is where he blames Hillary Clinton for everything, which, to my knowledge, she had no role in. But the point is that, fundamentally, it's also about the idea that he could be on the receiving end of one of those kinds of uprisings. And you can argue in some ways everything he's done for the last 12 years has been dedicated to the proposition that he's not going to be on the receiving end of that.
That's certainly something you'd like to avoid. Okay, so listen, we've been talking close to an hour, and one thing I've been doing lately is having the first hour of these conversations in the public domain, which they've long been, and then having an overtime session that's available to paid subscribers to the Nonzero newsletter. I'm sure you're sympathetic to the idea of trying to extract money from the pockets of your newsletter subscribers. You haven't taken that step yet?
No. I get subscribers. Extract money sounds much harsher than the way I would put it.
You don't think that was a public relations coup there that I didn't just demonstrate my finesse? No, I'm joking. That's the last.
You're trying to reward subscribers.
I was
paid
joking.
Subscribers.
I was joking.
Yes, exactly.
You sympathize with my desire to have people support your noble mission in whatever way they can.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what I meant to say. I'm sorry. Anyway.
There we go.
So, you can become a paid subscriber. Just Google Substack. There's a link in the show notes to the podcast app. But seriously, we really do appreciate people supporting what we do here. And there's also written content you get and so on. The Friday Parrot Room with Mickey Kaus. You remember Mickey.
It's hard to forget, Mickey.
We'll leave it there. So thanks everybody who stayed with us this far, and thanks to those who are going to continue with us into overtime. And meanwhile, remember to subscribe to Dan's newsletter, Drezner's World.